my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to this discussion of Mark Lynch's latest book. It's called The Arab Uprisings, The Unfinished Revolutions of the New Middle East. Hooks Books is out in the lobby selling books, so I encourage you to get your own personal copy after the program. And for those of you who camped out to get a copy last night, I'm sure you can convince Mark to sign it anyway. So he'll be on hand to do that for you. In December 17th of 2010, a Tunisian fruit vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire to protest mistreatment by municipal officials. In so doing, he sparked revolutions that stretched across the Middle East and North Africa, and a set of uprisings that are continuing today. Many analysts foresaw the fragility of the regimes in the region. Few foresaw the timing or how these uprisings would unfold. But Mark Lynch certainly must have been among the first and the very earliest to foresee the transformative role that information and communications technologies, and particularly satellite television, would play in the Middle East and would play in setting the stages in these revolutions. Allow me to quote just briefly from Mark's last book, Voices of the New Arab Public, which he published in 2006. I'm going to squint because there's no light up here. What I call the new Arab public sphere, Mark wrote, is palpably transforming Arab political culture. It has already conclusively shattered the state's monopoly over information, rendering obsolete the ministries of information and the oppressive state censorship that was smothering public discourse. While this new Arab public cannot alone substitute for electoral democracy, it is doing something in many ways that is more important, building the underpinning of a more liberal, more pluralistic politics rooted in a vocal, critical public sphere. In his newest book, Mark shows us the still unfolding results of this new public sphere that he foresaw many years ago, and what it means for both US policy and the people of the region. He cautions us, though, that the Arab popular uprisings that we're seeing today are not nearly as new as many Americans would like to believe. And he cautions that there's no guarantee that today's revolutions will usher in the sort of democratic politics that most Americans would either recognize or hope for. But these revolutions, he also reminds us, were not about us. And I think that's one of the main themes of Mark's book. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. It's a pleasure to have Mark here, who's both a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for New American Security and a professor at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. We're also very honored to have leading this discussion tonight, Hesham Milam, the Washington Bureau Chief for Al Arabiya and a correspondent for the Lebanese daily An-Nahar. Full biographies of both of these distinguished gentlemen are in your packets. I encourage you to review them. And without further ado, Mr. Milam, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristen. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to thank the Center for New American Security for arranging this lovely discussion, hopefully. And I'm very happy and proud and thrilled to share the podium with Mark, whom I've known for many years. I don't know how many of you read the book. I had to read the book. And I have the paperback, and he has the hardcover. That tells you something. Take it from me, it's an excellent book. It's really a comprehensive book. And I advise you over the next weekend and the weekend after the next weekend to take a break from your spouse and kids and spend some quality time with Mark and read the book. I think Mark brings to the discussion or to the discourse now, this new discourse on the Arab uprising, a number of elements that very few people could claim. To begin with, Mark brings the kind of deep understanding and empathy of a complex Arab world. And his knowledge and understanding the Arab world is not only scholarly, which is important, but it is also intimate. And from the book, you can tell that he knew many of those activists in Tahrir Square and some of the leaders now who are calling the shots in new political order in Egypt and in Tunisia and Libya. He known them, people like Rashid Ghannouchi and others. So he brings in that kind of sophisticated knowledge of a region in turmoil and in transition. He brings also something else, which is a deep understanding, and he's one of the few historians, if you will, of the new Arab media. And that is very important, and we've seen the role of social media, and while Mark would be the first one, and I fully agree that this is not a Twitter revolution or a Facebook revolution, but definitely these new social media were very important, and mainly what was, I think he would agree with me, the outstanding importance of satellite technology and satellite stations, the saturation of the region with satellite stations that also made a difference in the Arab uprising. So he brings in that kind of knowledge of this new medium. The other thing that he brings to the discussion is an intimate knowledge of Washington. We all know many scholars who live in their own little world and they write good books, but they have really absolutely no idea about how decisions are made in Washington. And he knew many people in the Obama administration, and that allows him really to focus on what the Obama administration did, and probably more importantly, what it did not do during the uprising. And I think there is a great deal of nuanced understanding and analysis of the decision-making process that the Obama administration went through. So now, after this generous plugging of your book,
here comes the
let's start asking some questions. While reading the book, I couldn't but wonder how difficult it is to write as close as a comprehensive, definitive account of a phenomena that is still unfolding. It is as if you are being asked to analyze an ice cube on an extremely hot day where it keeps changing on you with each passing moment. How was it, for you, as someone who has been watching the region for a long time, to try to come up with a kind of comprehensive account of something that is unfolding?
Well, that's a really great question. But before I answer it, I just want to thank Kristen and the Center for New and American Security for hosting this event. And it's just really great to see so many people here, so many friends in the audience. And this is not just to get me softer questions, but it really is an honor to share the stage with Hisham, who I've known for quite some time and who's been a leader in the development of this new Arab media that I've been studying for so long. So now be nice to me. In terms of the, how do you write when you're trying to hit a moving target? I mean, part of the answer is blogging and Twitter. The very social media that I'm analyzing, I think also helps to build in you a spirit of trying to analyze in real time and trying to make sense of what's happening as it's happening. And so actually, when I was preparing for this, I went back and I read what I wrote on January 5th, 2011, and it actually holds up much better than I thought it would. And so that's reassuring. But it holds up in a sense of being aware of the possibility of the directions that things can go without really trying to make any solid predictions about it. Because I think that the way that I can understand what's happening in 2010, 2011, and what we're living through right now is that the driving force is something that's been developing for a very long time. I mean, we've lived through this, right? We've seen for the last decade this rising tide of popular protest, the transformation of the media, the growing failures of the Arab state system and of Arab leaders. And there's this very strong sense that these were structural changes from below. And as a political scientist, I can understand that and I can study that over time. And then this sudden eruption of change around the region, in a sense, those are the manifestations. Those are the symptoms, which you can then study on a case-by-case basis. But one of the things that I think the book tries to do, and hopefully succeeds at, is to place those eruptions within the context of those long-developing, long-brewing structural changes. You can't understand the response to Mohamed Bouazizi if you don't understand the history of Tunisian riots in the South in the 1980s and all the way through. You can't understand the response to Khalid Said in Egypt in January 25th without going back to the Kafaya movement and those incredibly brave, bold, and we at the time we thought foolhardy and crazy bloggers and activists who went out on street corners holding signs saying no to the succession of Gamal Mubarak. It seemed hopeless at the time, and yet they did it anyway. And so in a sense, I think it's really important, and what an academic can bring to these rapidly moving events is that sense of this has been building for a long time. The flip side of that is that I try not to get too either optimistic or pessimistic about specific things. I mean, when Hosni Mubarak falls, you get kind of carried away. When Syria descends into a horrific civil war, you get pretty depressed. But I really believe that we're looking at the structural change of the region that's going to take a long time to play out. And so you try and not get too high with the highs or too low with the lows. Okay. I will say that I finished writing the book right around Thanksgiving. And I sent out a memo to everyone in the Middle East, said, cool it. You know, nothing can happen between now and March. And so you see how much influence I have.
Good luck with that one. Okay, the title is The Arab Uprising, not uprisings, not in the plural. And one point that you make repeatedly throughout the book is that there is a shared narrative, there is a shared identity, that these movements should be seen as part of a whole. And while the focus, yes, immediate focus is on domestic issues, conditions in Tunisia or conditions in Egypt, but there is a subtext, if you will, that connects all of these uprisings into one kind of regional narrative, regional public space, shared identity, which is, I mean, that these words always appear in the book. Talk a little bit about, because there is a discourse here that these are isolated, that they're focused on only domestic issues, that the Arabs forgot Palestine, no regional concerns, no comprehensive outlook, but just, you know, immediacy on domestic issues only, while you say the opposite.
Well, I mean, every individual country clearly has its own its own specificity, but I think the thing which was so powerful and I think impossible to miss if you were embedded in Arab politics and in the Arab public sphere was how deeply and intensely interconnected everything was right from the beginning. And I mean, if you think about it, the idea that Yemenis would take to the streets because of something that happens in Tunisia, I mean, you just look at the map. I mean, they're very far apart. They're on opposite ends of the Arab world. They don't have a lot of trade relations. They speak different dialects. There's no obvious or natural reason why Yemenis should care about what happens in Tunisia. And yet, this goes back to that earlier book, Voices of the New Arab Public, that perhaps there's always been pan-Arabism, but there's a new kind of Arab unity and Arab cohesion driven by this new media. And that developed over that decade. And so, in a sense, the roots of the idea that Yemenis are inspired by Tunisia goes back to the regional response to the Second Intifada, to the American invasion of Iraq, to the response to the war in Gaza, to the response to the war in Lebanon. This sense of an entire region united by, these are the things which make us Arab. We care about these things because this is who we are. And so a Yemeni or a Syrian or an Egyptian looks at Tunisia and he doesn't say, well, that's interesting what they are doing. He says, this is what we are doing, and we should be doing the same thing. And especially in those first few months, just the tight integration of the protest was impossible to miss. I will never forget those moments sitting there watching on, I'm sorry, Hisham, watching on Al Jazeera, as they would show.
That's one of the few mistakes I keep saying in the book, but that's okay.
But you're watching in real time as they're showing images of simultaneous protests in half a dozen Arab cities, all of them chanting the exact same slogans at the exact same time. Al-Shab yurid isqat al-nizam, irhal, irhal. I mean, these sorts of things that they're imitating each other in very direct terms. And then you get something like when Gaddafi, unlike most of the other Arab leaders, decides to unleash the gunships and the machine guns on protesters on the first day. This was incredibly shocking because for the last 6 weeks, people have been watching on TV and living through situations where leaders didn't do that. They could have, and they didn't. And that deep, visceral shock at what happened, I think, helps to explain the Arab willingness to then support the intervention in Libya. But I will say that I think that largely comes to an end by roughly mid-March.
I'm going to ask you about that.
Yeah, okay.
But also, what is interesting about the book is, like you said earlier in the first question answer, is that you put it in the context, that you cannot understand Bouaziz's the demonstration that occurred after his self-immolation unless you put it in the context of the struggle of the Tunisians. And you talk repeatedly about the long legacy and tradition of Arab activism, of demonstrations, of uprisings that were aborted. And you talk about how in the past the old order reasserted itself. And then all of these uprisings failed. What leads you to believe that these new uprisings, or one comprehensive regional uprising, has a better chance?
Well, I guess I just have to believe it. I have to hope that it's true. But I think there are reasons for thinking that it is. But I mean, the point that I tried to make, and it's good that you single it out, is that we have had these moments of enthusiasm before. One of the most famous books about the Egyptian Revolution by Lenny Binder. The moment of enthusiasm. In each case, it gives way to a deeper and darker authoritarianism. And this happens again and again and again through Arab history. And so I think that the activists of today and the hopes for regional change are fighting against, they're very much swimming upstream. The reasons why I think they can are, once again, I think rooted in this notion that this generation really is different. I mean, I believe that Arab authoritarianism was never just about guns. It was never just about the torture chambers, and it was never just about the oil, although all of those things helped. It was also about the ability to control public sphere, to control ideas, to prevent people from even thinking about challenging. And I think we are never going back to that. I think that it is simply impossible at this point for any Arab regime, no matter how oppressive, to restore that condition of not just physical, but mental and public silence. And so, again, this is a long developing thing, and it's rooted both in a youth generation which has grown up with mobile phones and satellite imagery and the internet. It's rooted in globalization, and it's rooted in a lot of things. But I do think that while the pushback that we're seeing from Arab regimes right now, the empire, the counter-revolution, the empire strikes back, it's expected, it's predicted, and it's doing better than I'd like to see. But I don't think that it's going to win in the long term.
I want to ask you about the counter-revolution. But before that, I think at one time you say that there may have been a revolution in Egypt, but the revolutionaries never took the reins of power.
Right.
And also before that, you talk a little bit about what I would describe the predicament of the activists, who were excellent at mobilization, excellent at using the street, being extremely creative, but they were not as good as practicing politics. Right. While they were mobilizing the groups in Tahrir Square and other places, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis were engaged in retail politics, knocking on doors, introducing their candidates, and doing politics the real way. But talk about how that moment of enthusiasm was almost suffocated in March.
Most Egyptian activists now feel the revolution failed, and they're very alienated, very dispirited, and part of that, I think, is inevitable. I mean, anytime you have a revolution, you're going to have exaggerated expectations, which are inevitably going to be frustrated, and I think we all saw that coming at the time. But also, I think it's built into the notion of these activists. I mean, when activists are by definition a minority. It's a small group of people, and there's a real tension between revolutionary legitimacy. We should lead this country because we led the revolution, and democratic legitimacy. And this was easy to see coming well in advance. I was writing about this all the way back in March. You saw it in the referendum in Egypt in March, right, when the revolutionaries campaigned full-heartedly for a no vote on a referendum which laid out a military-led transition, and 79% voted for it. And that was a real shock to them. They thought that they brought down Hosni Mubarak and they would be invested with this revolutionary legitimacy, and it just didn't happen. And I think what's been happening for the last year is that the military has been running an unfortunately quite successful campaign dividing them from the people. The Islamists, both the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis, have gotten out there, built their organizations, and built real electoral machines. And unfortunately, a lot of the activists themselves have responded to this by retreating from institutional politics. They keep going back to the streets with ever smaller numbers and ever less effect. And I predicted about a year ago that, that regardless of how the elections or the transition played out, that I expected to see the same 3,000 activists in the streets protesting in Tahrir in 3 years, because that's what they know, that's what they do. And, but nevertheless, it's been disappointing that they haven't been able to find a point of entry into the system.
Now, when we talk about the forces of counter-revolution, right, what are we talking about, specifically in the case of Egypt? Are we talking about SCAF? Are we talking about the military? Are we talking about the entrenched economic interests? Are we talking about societal forces, cultural forces? I mean, one could argue there is a problem, for instance, with the way Salafis see minorities, the way Salafis see deal with gender issues. Is this part also of the counter-revolution? And also, is there a counter-revolution on the regional level, on the where in this counter-revolution, regional powers as well as powers beyond the region may also be involved in order to arrest this wave and to reassert or to reestablish or to resurrect the old order?
I don't think that you want to pack too much into the concept of counter-revolution, because then it becomes basically everything except for this small group of revolutionaries. I think it's important to break those things down as you did. I think that, I mean, maybe it's just because I'm an American liberal, but I don't believe that democracy is counter-revolutionary in a sense that if the revolutions are about bringing about democratic change, then in a sense you have to be willing to accept the verdict of the ballot box as long as you have constitutions that provide freedoms and guarantees and the like. The real counter-revolution, in my opinion, is led by the regimes and the forces of the status quo. Whether that's the military in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the GCC, which basically sought very early on to limit the spread of the revolutions and to contain them. And so in places like Egypt, that meant trying to prop up the military and kind of block more radical revolutionary change. But elsewhere in the region, I mean, I wrote a blog post about this a couple weeks ago, and I talk about this in the book. That there's this amazing single week in March when basically you see this is when the empire strikes back. This is when Saudi forces roll into Bahrain and completely crush the protest movement there. And I don't think they've actually won there. I think they've simply bought themselves a generation worth of trouble. But they did go in and clear the streets and bulldoze Pearl Roundabout. That same week is when Yemeni military snipers opened fire in Sana'a University and the army splits, and what had been a peaceful protest movement turns into a military standoff and a really bloody few months. It's the week when the Egyptian referendum happens. It's the same week that NATO begins bombing in Libya, and it's the same week when the first protests break out in Daraa in Syria. And so kind of across the region, this is a single week when you go from this tightly unified, seemingly unstoppable wave of change to all of a sudden the fragmentation of the regional agenda, the introduction of war and violence, and kind of the real shift in tone. I mean, it matters when you've been spending the last 3 months watching people dancing and having parties in Tahrir Square, and all of a sudden, instead, you're seeing ragtag guys in pickup trucks and bandanas shooting, and pictures of dead bodies, and the entire tone of regional politics changed.
I want to ask you about Syria, and I want to ask you about U.S. policy, but let me raise an issue that is of a great deal of concern and worry to me, which is the rise of the Islamists, particularly in Egypt, but also in Tunisia, and likely in Libya, and if Assad falls, probably in Syria. And you say correctly that Islamism has been transforming Arab public culture for generations. And but you also talk about the Salafis, and you believe that the move from the violent margins into the mainstream of domestic public life will normalize Islamist movements. I tend to have a more jaundiced view of the Islamists. And while we're talking about Egypt, and I was just chatting with Stephen Cook here, were you, like most people, because you wrote the book, at least what I read here is before the final election results in Egypt. It seems to me that everybody who was a student of Egyptian affairs miscalculated, because people would tell you and would reassure the secularists like me that, oh, don't worry, 20, 25, 30%, not beyond that. They will never make it in the ballot box beyond 30%. We ended up with 70%. 23% is Salafis, and the rest were is there a yardstick that you could use? I mean, you talk about parliamentary elections and the ballot box. I mean, ballot box and parliamentary elections, if they don't occur in a society where there is rule of law and checks and balances, don't mean a thing. Perón was elected. You know, Mussolini was elected. Is there a yardstick that you would use to judge the? I mean, I would judge any government in the world by the way it treats it respects civil rights and political rights, and how it treats its minorities, and how it deals with gender issues. I personally have a problem with how Islamists, regardless of their stripes, maybe this is a broad, you know, secular judgment, but would you use, I mean, what is the yardstick that you would use with the Islamists in Egypt and Tunisia and other places? Not what they say publicly, I don't care about words. How they treat minorities, how they treat women. Let's be blunt about it.
Let's
allay my concerns.
Well, I don't know if I can, but that's 4 really good questions. Let me try and walk through them. So on the question of the kind of Islamist success in the elections, and this is completely unsurprising. I mean, I think most of us saw this coming. I mean, everybody could...
Salafis?
Well, I'll get to that second. Just Islamists in general. Everyone could see this coming because of this transformation of public culture over decades, the Muslim Brotherhood's organizational strength, and actually, you know, so I interviewed Khalid al-Shatar, who basically is the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt at this point, and this was they were kind of like going back and forth, but he basically said, we're going to win, I would say, roughly 39% of the seats in parliament, and that's what they did. The inflated number was part of their list, but not members of their own party. They basically hit their marks. A highly professional, extremely disciplined political machine did exactly what they expected. And we all said at the time that liberal parties are poorly organized. The activist groups didn't do anything, really, to get out there and prepare for the elections. They couldn't decide if they were going to boycott or not. And when they did try, they didn't have the money or the resources to compete. And so everybody predicted that they would be wiped out. The big surprise was, as you say, the Salafis and the former regime elements. And that's the part that everyone always misses, is that, yes, the Salafi 20% was a big surprise, but everybody expected that the former NDP, the former ruling party members, were going to come in with 25, 30% of the vote, that they'd be able to, these would be all like rich, famous people from, especially out in the provinces, that they'd be able to buy their way back into parliament. And they didn't. They were completely wiped out. And that, to me, is one of the biggest unrecognized victories of the revolution, that people don't want to claim credit for their own success, that basically the NDP was destroyed in those elections, and it wasn't for lack of trying. They put money, effort, organization, the most expensive Washington-based political consultants into it, and they were destroyed. And so the Salafis didn't take votes away from the Muslim Brotherhood. The Salafis won the seats that the NDP vacated, essentially, is what happened. I do think that it's good to have the Salafis in regular politics. I think it's great. I mean, it's better to have the Salafis in politics.
Me now.
Well, no, it's great that they're in politics. And you know why? Because they are just bouncing from position to position, scaring the hell out of people, and basically moving from this kind of barely known subculture to the center, and a lot of people look at them and don't like what they see. It's causing all kinds of problems for the Muslim Brotherhood, who now all of a sudden have to defend their right flank and have to figure out how to position themselves. They can't just say Islam is the solution anymore, because now they're facing more radical Islamists, and they need to figure out how to position themselves. They're struggling with it. And they're also facing, you know, they made this very calculated effort. We're going to win 40%, enough to give us power, but not enough to scare people. But now the Salafis came along and scared everybody. And so it's complicated their own strategy. And quite frankly, I mean, I would rather have the Salafis in politics than having them go off into the radical fringe. But there's a big change, though, in the way people like me either do or should think about kind of the Muslim Brotherhood or Salafis in politics now. Because I think before the revolutions, I think that the only principled position for someone who believes in democracy to take was to defend the right of the Muslim Brotherhood to participate in politics, to condemn Hosni Mubarak, to condemn people who were trying to deny them the right to participate. But now that that right is there and they're winning, you can want them participating in politics and want them to lose. And this is why when I talk to my interlocutors from the Muslim Brotherhood now, they're like, wait, I thought you were on our side. It's like, well, no, I'm not on your side. I'm on the side of democracy. And you guys, when you were being hauled into jail on trumped up charges, I defended that on principle. And now if you do the sorts of things that you're talking about, I'm going to criticize you on principle. And I think that's the right position for people in our position to take. The moment that really matters in a place like Egypt now is the writing of the Constitution and what kinds of guarantees are in there. And I cannot tell you how disturbed I am that our liberal friends in Egypt seem to have collectively decided to walk out of that chamber.
Right.
They basically decided, too many Islamists, we're not going to win, so we're going to take our ball and go home. I think it's historically irresponsible on their part, and I've written that, and now they're all mad at me again. But I really think that they needed to be in there fighting for those kinds of protections. At this point, our only hope is that the Egyptians prove to be as advanced as the Ennahda party in Tunisia, where it was Ennahda, the Tunisian equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which basically stepped up and said, no, we're not going to base the constitution on Sharia, on Islamic law, which is a pretty shocking position for an Islamist party to take if you think about it. But they're playing a long game. They are thinking about trying to create a robust set of political institutions which are going to benefit them. And so it's not like they're acting against self-interest, but they're savvy enough to recognize that there's a significant portion of the population that is not Islamist, that doesn't want to be dominated by Islamism, and they want to reassure them. I'm not sure that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has made that leap yet, and so I think this constitution writing period is quite dangerous.
I mean, just a quick comment, and then you don't have to answer it, but don't you think that in the case of Tunisia, we are dealing here, or you're benefiting from the legacy of Bourguiba and secularism in Tunisia, because there are certain things you cannot do in Tunisia, because women have been, more educated, participating in the labor force. You have, equal rights in divorce. I mean, all sorts of things that were revolutionary, quote unquote, in Tunisia, years ago. We don't have them, even in Egypt. Yeah. So, I mean,
to some extent, I mean, it's a very interesting point, and to some extent, I think it's true. In the sense you had a stronger left, you had a stronger women's movement, stronger secular traditions, especially in kind of the northern coastal urban areas. But that said, that didn't really show in the elections. The election results, Ennahda dominated as thoroughly as the Muslim Brotherhood did. Salafis opted not to run, which I think removed that challenge on the flank for the Constituent Assembly. But
okay, I'm supposed to turn to the. But it can't. Can I just ask one question? Use my prerogative as the moderator here. Let's talk a little bit about the United States. You criticized the Obama administration because of as the Arabs would love to say, double standards on the issue of Bahrain. But you say that they did certain things right, not to jump into the fray in Syria, did the right thing in Libya. The speech in May of last year was fine, although it did not present a comprehensive, doctrine, if you will. But essentially, it treated it well. But then you call on the United States for changing its approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict in fundamental ways, and you raised doubts whether the political body politics in Washington would make these kind of qualitative, almost radical changes in approach, particularly to the issue of Palestine, because at one time I was writing on the notes, I said the persistence of Palestine, because you always talk about, although you don't use that phrase, but there is a persistence of the Palestine issue here, and how it did introduce a corrosive elements to the U.S. Arab approach, the American approach to the Arab world.
I mean, I think that, again, it's much easier to be a critic, but I actually think that on most of the broad strokes of things, I think the administration has gotten things right. I mean, I think that people say it acted too slow, but I mean, my Lord, in Egypt, we decided to tell our closest ally and best friend in the region to step down 6 days after protests began. I mean, that's not really fast in Twitter time, but in the real world, that's astonishing. And I think they did an extremely good job of leaning on the Egyptian military to not open fire. And imagine if they had done what Gaddafi did or what Bashar al-Assad did. They could have cleared Tahrir Square if that's what they had wanted to do, if they had decided that was more important. And I think we played an important role in stopping that. I think that Generally speaking, the administration has been very good about not trying to make this all about us, not trying to, say, oh, American leadership of the democracy movement. They were absolutely right that this was not about us, and the region was not crying out for American leadership on this. And I think they were right to see early on that the inevitability of this change, that this was a serious comprehensive change and wanting to get on the right side of it. But I think where the criticisms come in is that to get on the right side of it, you would have to do things which we were not able or willing to do. I think Bahrain was something which my guess is that they thought was just a throwaway. That, okay, the Saudis really want this, we'll let them have it, because we're going to focus on the big fish, Egypt and Tunisia, dealing with Libya, and Bahrain, no one cares about Bahrain, it's a tiny little island. But people did care about it. That at that time, this was seen as evidence that the United States, when push comes to shove, was going to put its interests above its values. And since then, I think a lot of the fears that we had have manifested, where it's become highly sectarianized, and it's become a real, I think, a real gaping open wound in the Gulf and in the way things have gone. But I think generally speaking, when you get to the Palestine question, I would phrase it a little more broadly, is that you had this rushing surge of enthusiasm for the new, but the old doesn't go away. Iran is still there, the centrifuges are still going, the desire to contain Iran is still there. You can't escape that. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, no one pays any attention to it anymore, but it's still there, and if the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict tells us anything, it's that it's going to reassert itself at the most inconvenient time, whether you want to ignore it or not. And so basically, I think what we're looking at is the old Middle East doesn't go away just because the new Middle East appears. And I think that the reason that the Palestinian issue is so deadly to American efforts to try and position itself on the side of Arab public opinion is that it's not going away. It's seen as the ultimate example of double standards, and you're left in a position where almost extremely predictably, we are going to be put in a position such as when we had to veto the UN thing, or when you get the resumption of violence in Gaza. Repeatedly, we're going to be put in positions where we're going to have to take extremely unpopular positions, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Well, this is the moment now where I throw you to the lions.
All right.
And
Welcome,
we take
lions.
questions. I think there are mics somewhere in. What's the? Okay.
But is it are they lions or ducks?
Yeah, there are no Bashar
Sorry,
Assads here. Okay.
It's a Syrian joke.
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, exactly. It's the lady here. Be succinct and short, not like me. It's okay.
Could you give us your views, Mark, on how do you think, and over the long run, these new, more democratic representative governments, will they reinforce sectarian identities? Will they embed, sectarian identities in terms of government jobs and that thing? And are there countries that you see that are this will more likely be the case, mm-hmm. or are there other countries where you think this will less likely be the case, like sectarianism will fade or at least play a lesser influence?
It's an extremely good question, and it's extremely difficult to give a generic answer to it for exactly the reason that you say. That basically there's a lot at stake in terms. It's not just having elections; it's kind of the reorganization of power. And a lot, I would say, depends on choices being made now, kind of the early constitutive choices about constitutions and ruling coalitions. So, for example, in Egypt, a lot of people believe, I think with good cause, that a lot of the source of tension between Coptic Christians and Islamist groups, especially the Salafis, was stirred up by the Mubarak regime, that this was a tactic used to justify authoritarian rule, to divide and conquer. And so many Egyptians hope that moving to something which is genuinely democratic, if it contains the kind of guarantees that Hisham was talking about for minorities and public freedoms and the like, would actually reduce sectarianism there, that it would allow for a normalization of Christian-Muslim relations in Egypt. And so that there's hope there. And if you look at Tunisia, where you don't really have sectarian issues, but you certainly have like regional issues, or even Libya, where you have, again, not sectarian issues, but deep regional divides and the like, you can see we don't know the outcomes yet. We don't know what those constitutions are going to look like, but you can see people actively and deeply trying to engage with it. How do we design a political system to prevent those problems from reemerging? And so if in countries like that where that you can see at least the hopes of democracy making things better and not worse. But the problems really do come, though, when you have clearly minority-led regimes, like in Syria, or I would argue in Jordan, or in Saudi Arabia to some extent, certainly Bahrain, where genuine democracy would require the genuine overturning of political order and putting the previously oppressed majority on top. And there you do run into a situation where it appears to be incompatible. And so that's why we were very, very worried or skeptical about the prospect of seeing genuine, like a Sunni king in Bahrain accepting true democracy almost by definition means that it's not going to be a Sunni king much longer. And I think that's kind of the way that he would see things, or the royal family would see things. So just to finish up, though, that's where you look at a case like Syria, where you have the Syrian National Council, just yesterday, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, trying to go to great lengths to reassure people about tolerance, inclusion, respect for minorities, and that sort of thing. But I don't see a lot of people believing those promises at this point. It's very difficult to make them credible.
A hand there, gentleman there.
Thank you. The Islamist movements in the Arab world today are powerful, yes. They are winning the elections, yes. They will probably have a large say in writing the constitution, yes. Practicing the power, though, is a different matter. Are they really equipped for it? They will govern, and they will need to make some choices. Egypt and Tunisia, for example, they will need to have a strong say on what they want to do with tourism, for example, which gives a lot of money to the Egyptians, to the Egyptian people. So what will they say beyond this matter? Also, they could be fragmented. They don't all, today they are monolithic. It's easy to be monolithic when you're in opposition to an autocrat, but when you are in power, then there will be some diversions. And the idea is, how will they stand up in the process of handling the power? That's one. And second, the other minorities, the liberals, that are today very much fragmented, wouldn't they want to take this opportunity in order to coalesce? Are they politically mature enough to bring another solution to the subject?
On your first question, I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think that, well, actually, yes doesn't quite answer it. I do think that the challenge of governing is going to be a major problem for a lot of these movements, because it's very easy to be in opposition and to criticize. And so the Muslim Brotherhood does have a lot of experience in parliament, for example, of focusing on corruption and trying to hold the government accountable. But governing is something else entirely. Then you have to make choices, and I think the example you gave is a really good one. I have no doubt that most members of the Muslim Brotherhood would love nothing more than to ban bikinis at beaches and stop selling liquor.
How shocking.
Yeah, I mean, that they have values. This is against their values. Why wouldn't they want that? But the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood looks at this and says this is going to kill the tourism industry, and it's going to scare the liberals and the secularists. And so they then have to make that choice. Do they please their base, or do they do kind of this responsible thing? Right now, they still haven't really been forced to make that choice, because they're in a parliament, but the parliament doesn't have any power yet, and the military still is there as the guarantor of all actual decisions. But I think the more that they have to choose, the more problematic it's going to be. But I wouldn't actually urge people to put too much faith in the prediction that they're going to fail at this. Because, a lot of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, certainly the leaders of Tunisia's Ennahda party, they are smart. And they are working very hard at this. And I just remember in the middle of the elections, this was in December, I had another conversation with Khalid al-Shatar, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this came up. One of the questions was there's a question about the Camp David Treaty. Are you going to abrogate the Camp David Treaty? And there was a question about booze and liquor and bikinis. And he literally waved this away with his brush of his hands. We don't have time for this. We have massive economic problems. We need economic development. We need to attract foreign investment. We need to fix the educational system. We need to reform state institutions. And all those other things can wait. That was a pretty impressive answer. And so, I mean, I think they're going to have challenges, but I wouldn't just simply assume that they're going to fail those challenges. They might or they might not.
Lady there. By the way, Rashid Ghannouchi assured us that he will allow women to wear bikinis and allow booze, particularly for the tourism. So that's a nice assurance.
Well, now that we've got that settled. Mark, I have a quick question. You were talking, obviously, before as you said, the Empire Strikes Back in March. This new look and new face to Pan-Arabism, and that in a way that very much I think the Western world wasn't expecting and was taken a bit aback by. And in some cases, in some instances, there were arguments that this actually could be perceived as a threat and that we needed to take this from a defensive position and look at this from a security position and how that affects our position. What do you say to those people that say that look at this new burgeoning youth Pan-Arab identity and see trouble?
Well, to quote J. Cole, I think they're scared of it and they should be. Because basically what's happening, never mind. Basically what's happening is you're seeing the empowerment of a public which has pretty strong beliefs about these things and is not willing to make the accommodations that Arab autocrats have been willing to make. And so the strategy in the region is going to become a lot more complicated. You're not going to be able to count on a Hosni Mubarak equivalent to police Gaza for you. You're not going to be able to count on the kinds of things we've always been able to count on. Now, I actually think that this plays out a little bit differently for Israel and for the United States. I think Israel is right to be deeply worried about these changes because they're so far gone in terms of Arab public opinion, and I think the last decade has made things many, many, many times worse. If you compare where Israel is in the Arab world today to where they were, say, in 1995, 1994, it's actually quite shocking and depressing. But that's the wages of the policies they've chosen to pursue with regard to the peace process and the various wars and the like. They've made no effort whatsoever to reach out to Arab public opinion, whereas I think the United States has. And sometimes it's failed, sometimes it's succeeded. But there's a much more of a reservoir of hope for the United States and a willingness to continue to work with the United States. So I think it threatens the U.S. It should be seen by the United States as an opportunity. I mean, look, if the region becomes more in line with our values, that is going to make the region harder for us. There's no question about that. But we're used to that. We're used to our allies giving us trouble. I mean, have you talked to Japan about Okinawa lately? I mean, the Philippines about military bases. This is not new to us, and we should be able to handle that as a mature, confident democracy dealing with other democracies. So in a sense, yes, it is a threat. But I think it's a good kind of threat to have. And a lot of the other things, and I could go through other aspects of it in terms of Islamism, will it normalize or not, and all that stuff. But I think the general theme is that, yeah, there's a lot of things we should be worried about. But in a sense, this is what we've said we've wanted all along. We can't now run away from it because it's arrived.
We've been doing it with Turkey for the last 10 years, at least.
But look at the relationship between the United States and Turkey now. It's actually, despite the fact that Turkey is more self-confident, assertive, and has a much more popular foreign policy, we've been able to work with them quite closely. And certainly there's turbulence and hiccups along the way, and they do a lot of things which we don't like, but at the end of the day, they're a stronger ally. And I think that the core of any kind of meaningful liberal foreign policy should be that we want strong friends. And the core of our problem in the Middle East for the last decade has been that our friends are weak. That it doesn't matter that Hosni Mubarak was our friend because he was worthless. It doesn't matter that the Saudis were our friends because they were useless. And in a sense, what you want are strong friends who are confident, share your values, and are able to do things in an effective way. And so I think that you're going to have serious transition costs, but hopefully we'll move to the kind of world where we have a Middle East where our friends are strong, self-confident, and democratic. It's taken a long time to get there.
And accountable to their own people.
And accountable to their own people. And in a sense, that should be at the heart of any liberal foreign policy, in my opinion. And again, it doesn't make things easy, but I think it's the right way to go. The other part, by the way, is we couldn't have stopped it if we wanted to.
Sure.
So in a sense, you just have to deal with reality.
I think the lady has the mic, but okay, go ahead.
Coincidentally enough, Professor Lynch, I was going to ask about Turkey. If you could speak to it, if you could speak to its increasing role regionally in light of the Arab uprising, especially in Syria, because that's really unfolded since Thanksgiving. And then also to the extent that it's attractive, whether you think Arabs are interested in the Kemalist model. Thank you.
Which model?
The Kemalist.
Kemalist.
Mustafa Kemal. Good question. You know, it's funny because I actually just wrote something in the Cairo Review just like last week about this, because there was no country in the region better positioned for the Arab Spring than Turkey. They were an extremely attractive model, both mildly Islamist and democratic. They were able to have good relations with everybody, both the United States and Europe, and with Iran and Syria. They were perfectly positioned as a swing state. Economic, their traders are all over the region. Soft power. People wouldn't shut up about those Turkish soap operas that were winning hearts and minds. So they were perfectly positioned, but it hasn't actually manifested. They've really, I think, underperformed in the last year, and I think Syria has a lot to do with it. In that there was, in a sense, a bubble of Turkish influence that people thought that they actually did what they said, unlike most Arab leaders and most Arab countries, that they would actually deliver. And in Syria, I think a lot of us bought into this myth that they had great influence over Bashar al-Assad, and their links to the trading community would allow them to exercise pressure. And it turned out to simply be not the case. And I think that their waffling and inability to deliver on Syria I think has really undermined their reputation, both the attractiveness of their model, but also their reputation for power. And so I think that has undermined them quite a bit.
Okay, we have a question here in the front.
We have a question from Twitter. This comes from Aaron Zellin, who's a research associate at Brandeis. He wants to ask, should Salafi parties be legalized in Tunisia, and why or why not?
Should they be legalized? I mean, I think that the criteria for the legalization of political parties should be consistent and clear. I mean, basically, you have to commit to the Constitution. You have to commit to nonviolence. And if you meet the legal requirements, then you should be allowed to participate. I think that a problem can come when you have existing laws on the books which would justify ruling out parties which deserve to be included. So, for example, right now, technically, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian constitution still bans, the new constitution, the recently revised one, bans parties based on religion. So the 70% of the Egyptian parliament is technically illegal. And that doesn't seem legitimate to me. But I think it's perfectly legitimate to require that political parties commit to nonviolence, to honoring and respecting the Constitution, and things like that.
Okay. No, in the back, guy with the hand there.
The guy with the
hand. Not this one, the other one. Keep raising your hand. I know you, but it doesn't.
Not anymore, though.
Okay.
Hi. So my question is, Professor Lynch, you've written about the idea of a new norm about the way that Arab monarchs and leaders have to treat their citizens, namely without killing them en masse after the Libya and Syria involvement of the Arab League against, rather than for, mass killing. My question is, one, to what extent is that related to the emergence of a new Arab public sphere and the uprisings? And two, will this survive escalation in Syria or Bahrain?
Yeah, to me, this is one of the most interesting and counterintuitive things which has happened over the last year. This bizarre notion that Arabs, for some reason, shouldn't kill their own people. I mean, because empirically, it's not true. I mean, that's what Arab leaders do. They kill their own people. And they get away with it and pay no penalty whatsoever. In 1988, 1989, Saddam butchered hundreds of thousands of his people and decimated hundreds of villages. And his penalty was that he had to get American wheat deals and American political support. No penalty for it whatsoever. Same thing with Syria in 1982.
Omar al-Bashir.
Omar al-Bashir. I mean, basically, the norm in Arab politics has been one of state sovereignty and complete indifference to those kinds of norms. And yet suddenly, Now there has been articulated this standard, this normative standard, that Arab leaders who kill their people en masse have lost their legitimacy. And this has, of course, been something that Barack Obama has said and the US has said repeatedly, but it's also coming from the Arab League. It was in the Yemen plan, the GCC plan for Yemen. It was in the Libya on Syria. And this has been repeated and has become at least a rhetorical justification for policy. And obviously, like most normative statements, it's honored more in the breach, and people always think that it applies to others and not to themselves, and it's got a long way to go before it's actually compelling and internalized, but it's out there, and it's hard to walk back and hard to simply say that it didn't happen. And does it have to do with the new Arab public sphere? Partly, because it makes it useful, right? That there is this norm now to appeal to, and also because of just, I think, the visibility of the butchery. And I think that that's where, in some ways, everyone talks about Facebook and Twitter, but I think YouTube has been really transformative in kind of making very real and very vivid the horrors, that people see it, they cannot escape it, and there's this documentary evidence that's put before you that you can't pretend that it isn't happening. It's in your face every day, and it starts on YouTube, goes to the social media, goes to a lot of the
finally we get our
finally you get your due. But it's there now in a way that it can't be, you can't pretend not to know about it anymore the way that we all used to be able to pretend.
It's true in the case of Syria, because when
Especially
you compare what's
Syria.
happening now in Syria and to what happened to Hama in 1982, I mean, nobody saw
It didn't
anything
take
like
6
that.
weeks for information to trickle out with a few brave reporters.
True.
The flip side of that, of course, is that there's so much disinformation and information warfare
And you cannot
going
verify
on
a lot
now.
of things.
It's
That's
very
true.
difficult to verify things, but still, I think that that's a big part of it. It's just the visibility.
Okay, the gentleman there, and not you, the one behind. He raised his hand repeatedly. Here, keep raising your hand now. See, he will see. Yo. Microphone on the other side, all right? That's nice collaboration.
Not to have a 2003 to 2011 redux, but what about Iraq in terms of all these uprisings? Do you see Maliki as being more helpful in terms of dealing with Syria and Iran? And this is the first, say, spring that the U.S. hasn't been around to tamp down on the Kurdish unrest. And you have another Barzani speech of Nowruz where he's talking about having a free Kurdistan. So where do you see Iraq going in the near term, especially with the Kurdish Arab tensions rising?
You know, it's funny because everyone, I think that it's characterized the entire Iraq war debate in the United States that everybody always radically overestimates how much we matter. And what strikes me the most about the American withdrawal from Iraq is how irrelevant it's been. That the trends in Iraq are pretty much exactly the same as they were when we were there, 2009, 2010, kind of after the change in the operational U.S. presence. The sectarian groups and political parties in Iraq aren't cooperating with each other. Well, that's been true all along. They refused to reconcile. Yep, they refused to reconcile when we were there. There's bombs going off in Baghdad. There were bombs going off in Baghdad when we were there. The Kurds are talking about seceding. The Kurds were talking about seceding when we were there. I mean, and actually it's the mouse that hasn't roared. It's that, yes, Iraq is a pretty dysfunctional political system. That's what happens when you invade it, destroy all of its institutions, and then descend it into an abattoir of civil war for 6 years. Yes, there's all kinds of unresolved political issues, but we didn't resolve them either. And so in a sense, I actually see it as a really good thing that now they have all the same problems that they had before, except we're not in the middle of them anymore. And I think that's actually a pretty good place to be. It's also been quite striking that, of course, the natural inclination is to assume that Nouri al-Maliki, as a Shia sectarian leader, will incline towards Iran. And of course, Iran has all kinds of influence in Iraq, as it's been cultivating that influence for the last decade, not just with Shia parties, but with all parties spreading the money and the ties around. But it's really interesting. What do we see right now? We see Iraq hosting an Arab summit. We see Iraq racing to reconcile with, do everything it can to sign deals with the Kuwaitis, with the Saudis, trying to find ways to patch things up. And, the U.S. spent a decade trying to convince the Gulf to open up to Iraq, and they didn't do it. And now all of a sudden they're doing it. In other words, there's a lot here that is going on because of what's happening internal Iraqi politics, which really has very little to do with whether the United States is there or not. And I think it's a useful lesson for the region as a whole to focus more on those inside things. And as to whether they can stand up to Iran on Syria and stuff like that, that's the main topic of discussion in Baghdad right now. And I think it puts them in an extremely uncomfortable position. And that's good. They should be in an uncomfortable position. And the more that they play a normal part in Arab politics, I think the better off we're going to be.
Okay, now we go to Twitter world. Mike?
This question comes from Ali N. She wants to know, do women have real opportunity for empowerment in the Arab uprising? And she comments that the Islamist situation in Egypt seems discouraging.
This is something, the situation of women is something that I'm proud to have published a number of articles on the Middle East Channel about this. The way that election laws have been drawn, I think, has been extremely bad for women, and the underrepresentation of women in the Egyptian and Tunisian parliaments.
That was shocking.
Shocking, but it's directly attributable to the way the election laws were drawn out. I mean, again, you make an election law a certain way. Political scientists could have told them how this was going to play out. To have 6 women in the constitutional drafting committee is an atrocity, and something which is really bad. The sad thing about this is that these are not to do with the Arab uprisings. These are to do with political institutional choices made after the uprisings, and again, these were extremely avoidable problems. And so right now in Libya, I've been happy to see that there's been a lot of pushback against attempts to draft laws that look somewhat similar, but I'm very depressed about the political role of women in the transitional countries. But over the longer term, I have to believe that kind of increased freedom and increased opportunity is going to affect women's opportunities as well. I think there's a huge divide between the way different Islamist movements think about this. It goes well back. The Muslim Brotherhood has traditionally been an encourager of women getting into the workplace, and in many ways their advocacy of veiling was a way of trying to mediate between getting women out into public space without compromising their public morality and that sort of thing, whereas the Salafis have typically been about keeping women in their homes and enforcing rigid gender segregation. I think those tensions are going to that's going to be one of the things which is going to rip them apart and is going to force them to take positions which I'm glad that there's going to be political systems to arbitrate that and to say, which vision of women's role in public life is going to win.
I'll come back to you, and I have to come back to her. And okay, yes, the lady there. Now you have 2 microphones.
Hi, my name is Nada Al-Wadi, and I am a journalist from Bahrain. I would like to thank you for basically discussing all this and including Bahrain in the discussion, which is an uprising that have been ignored by Arab media for a very long time. My question is actually about media, and I want to include Mr. Hisham in this question. How do you evaluate the role of media, the coverage and everything that was going on in media, and how they actually framed all these uprisings, and how that affected the crisis in all these countries? Thank you.
I think Hisham and I might have different takes on this, so I'll go first and then you can go second. I would say that it played an enormous role early on in unifying the political space and in really building this sense that everything was connected and everything was united. And I think that to the extent that we believe that these uprisings were good things, I think that the Arab media played, especially Al Jazeera, played an extremely positive role in those first few months in kind of putting everything into a unified narrative and highlighting the protests. And very much the storyline was very much one in which they identified the protesters as the good guys and the regimes as the bad guys and invited people to take those identifications. That was the story. I think that it takes a pretty radical change, though, in that week of March when you have the combination of kind of the counter-revolution, as Hisham put it, but also the Libya, where even though I was very much, and I still am, a supporter of the Libya war, the Libya intervention, on Al Jazeera and the Arab media, you do get this shift, this relentless, never-ending war coverage, which increasingly, and I think in Syria becomes even worse, cheerleading and kind of unobjective, not neutral coverage, which I think has really eroded both the credibility and the universality of those stations. And I think that the Al Jazeera management probably understands the damage that this has done, and all I can say is that the managing director who kind of made Al Jazeera what it is isn't with them anymore, and you can ask them why.
I don't think the Arab media, or the international media for that matter, but the regional media did not do justice to the uprising in Bahrain. I think this is a legitimate uprising. It is not made in Iran. Unfortunately, the way it was framed by a lot of people in the region, it was just through the mounting tension between the Arab states in the Arabian Peninsula versus Iran. We've seen it last year, was it last year, with the Houthi rebellion in Yemen, where it was also framed as an Iranian-made, while in fact, we had a briefing at one time with the American ambassador in Sana'a on the telephone. We were at the State Department, Steve Sesh, you know him, and he was telling us that the claims by Ali Abdullah Saleh at that time, the former president, that there was an Iranian ship unloading weapons to the Houthis was nonsense. So here you have an American ambassador telling you that our ally at that time, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was lying about the role of Iran, which did not exist in the Houthi rebellion. In the case of Bahrain, it was framed as a function, if you will, a subtext of the conflict between the Sunnis and the Shia in the region, particularly the Saudi-Iranian tension. And I think in the end, the Bahraini uprising, I fully agree with Mark, they bought some time. This is not, while in the last few months we've seen more and more sectarian coloration to it, but it did not start as a sectarian uprising. And we have to be blunt and honest about this. I mean, there is discrimination against the majority of the Bahraini people, who happens to be Shia. And it's a question of time when this uprising will explode again. So at best, they bought some time, but that's it.
I see Bahrain as one of the great tragedies of the Arab Spring for precisely this reason. I mean, we remember that Bahrain had one of the most well-developed and progressive civil societies and activist movements of any place, not just in the Gulf, but in the Arab world. You go back to the human rights groups and the political forums of 2005, 2006, and their ability to articulate a clear human rights vision for reform, not revolution.
Exactly.
And you saw the protest at the beginning of this year, of 2011, where they knocked themselves out trying to present a non-sectarian and reformist narrative, and then things radicalized on both sides. Sure. The moment was lost, and it really is tragic.
We have 1 minute, unfortunately. All great things must come to an end, including this great presentation by Mark. Would you like to take another question, or would you like to
I think we should wrap it up.
Do you want to say? I mean, do you want to wrap it up? Just,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, at least that's the signal I'm getting from
okay.
from
that's a signal from the powers that be.
From the real power.
Okay, exactly.
Yeah, no, I guess I would just once again thank everyone for coming. And I think one of the main points that my first answer to Hisham's question, but I think the one that kind of one or two big takeaways that I hope you take is that I think we really are just at the beginning of this generational change, and in highly unpredictable ways. I don't see us going back to the way things were. And in a sense, a lot of the policy debate in the United States is about, should we or should we not have kind of done this? But the point is, it was going to happen without us. It wasn't about us, and in a sense, responding to it and trying to position ourselves in such a way as to be able to align ourselves with this Arab public without compromising on our core interests and values, I think is going to be the defining challenge of American policy in the Middle East for the next decade or two. And I think it's a good time to start thinking about it. So thank you all.